Dara.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this Atlas special track on visual tourism. My name's Tara Duncan and I'm the chair of Atlas, and I just wanted to say thank you and welcome, and thanks for coming along to the session. Atlas is an organisation that's 30 years old next year. It is an association that encourages the networking and collaboration of those interested in tourism, specifically industry practitioners, students, researchers and teachers. And we have chapters in various areas around the world, including North America, Latin America, Oceania, Asia and Europe. Normally at this time of the year, we would be hosting our annual conference. And this year it was supposed to be hosted by Ambis in Prague. But obviously 2020 and the corona pandemic has meant that we haven't been able to do that. So instead, what we've done is a number of events online, including this special track on visual tourism, so visual methods in tourism. So I would like to ask Brian and Nika, who I think are our moderators, to carry on with the session. I'd like to say thank you very much for everyone joining us on YouTube. And please make sure to check out our other events that will be coming up this year. And hopefully we will see you all very soon at an event somewhere, somehow. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Brian Garrett. I'm from Swansea University. It's my pleasure this morning to be chairing this special session on visual tourism research. I'm doing so with my colleague, Nika Balamenu from University of Hertfordshire. Nika will play more of a background role, and she will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions from our speakers this morning, what we'd like you to do, please, is to put them into the chat, and then Nika can pick them up and we can fire them at our speakers. What we're going to do is have the speakers first. We have 3 this morning, and then when everybody's spoken, we're going to have a session for discussion at the end. So it's my pleasure this morning to welcome our 3 speakers. We have Therese Winter from Sheffield Hallam University and from the University of Sustainable Development, Eberswalde in Germany. We have Louise Todd from Edinburgh Napier University, and we have Eugenio Conti from Danala University, Mid-Sweden. I'm very excited to hear what they have to say this morning. What we're going to do is give each of them about up to 20 minutes to give their talk. And then at the end, we'll have the question and answers. What I'd like to do first is just to briefly introduce our subject for today, which is visual tourism research. And to do that, what I'd like to do is share my screen with you. So if you just excuse me for one moment, I will share my screen. Okay, I have disabled screen sharing at the moment, so hopefully Leontine will allow me to share. Excellent, thank you. So yes, this session is all about visual tourism research. I'm sure that most of you have joined us today because you know a little or a lot about it. But what I'd like to do, just in case we have those here who are not really sure what it's about, I looked for a good definition, and I found one by Gillian Rose, 2014. Visual research methods are methods which use visual materials of some kind as part of the process of generating evidence in order to explore research questions. And then later she says they vary greatly according to the visual methods used and the procedures for which those materials are subjected. So I believe visual research methods is a very, very diverse subject area, very diverse set of research methods and applications. And I think we're going to be seeing that this morning as we hear our speakers talk. Visual methods in terms of the materials used could be photographs, films, sketches, etc. I even found one yesterday when I was looking, which looks at people's tattoos as visual evidence of social phenomenon, which I thought was going to be an interesting paper, which I've set aside to read later today. And of course, these visual materials might be generated by researchers or by the research participants, or excitingly, through a collaboration between the two. And visual methods can include, but of course are not limited to, things like photographs. We could talk about volunteer employed photography, photo voice, auto photography. There's documentary filmmaking, video diaries, etc., visual semiotics. There's a huge range of diverse visual methods. So I personally believe this is a very exciting subject area. I believe it's an important subject area as well, because tourism research, I believe, has been dominated since its very beginning by the textual tradition. And I think that visual methods have the potential to challenge the position of textual research in tourism. So I think there are three main reasons why that. First of all, visual methods can generate data that other methods simply cannot. They can get to things so that we can understand them, that actually textual methods and other such methods, verbal methods, just have very little hope of reaching. They make things visible. Secondly, they can explore things that we take for granted in our everyday lives, things that are hidden to even the research participant until the research participant undertakes some kind of visual method, and then these things are revealed to them, and then they can be also revealed to the researcher. So visual methods can reveal the hidden. And thirdly, I think, and probably the most importantly, it gives voices to the participants, making their meanings known to people. If we use a textual or a verbal technique, it favors those who are good at verbal and textual expression. But a picture paints 1,000 words, to use the old adage. So that's all I wanted to say this morning about visual methods. I believe they're exciting. And without building up the speakers too much this morning, I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've got to say, because I believe that we're going to see a diverse set of exciting talks this morning by them. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is hand over to our first speaker, Therese Winter from Sheffield Hallam University, and I'm sure that she may wish to give some further introduction to herself. So Therese, I'm handing over the floor to you.
Yes, thank you. I will just share my screen as well, if I'm allowed to. Still waiting?
Yes, but I think Brian has to unshare.
Okay. Yes.
Looking for the button. I found it, so hopefully to. Excellent.
Yeah. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Therese Winter. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be part of this online event and also to contribute to the special track on visual methods in tourism. I'm very excited about visual methods, and I believe that tourism studies can benefit from using visual methods more widely. In the next few minutes, I'd like to share some of my experiences of applying photo elicitation with you. And I will cover the following points, which are: what is photo elicitation? What was photo elicitation? Why was photo elicitation useful in this study? What was the study context? And how was the study conducted? What photos did participants take? What did these photos mean to participants? And towards the end, I want to discuss whether and how photo elicitation can expose social inequality. So I came across visual methods during my PhD research, which I started in 2015 and completed last year. My research focused on exploring the relationship between tourism, poverty, and inequality from a political economy perspective. To research the topic, I used a mixed methods approach that combined quantitative value chain analysis and qualitative photo elicitation and interviews. Firstly, value chain analysis was applied to measure tourism-related income and to identify different socioeconomic groups. Secondly, to explore the perspectives of these different socioeconomic groups, I used photo elicitation and interviews. So for people who are not yet familiar with photo elicitation, what is it? It is a method that uses visuals to elicit comments from participants. It is based on the idea that visuals stimulate different brain processes so that not only more, but different kind of information can be generated. As Brian said already, visuals can be photographs, videos, painting, and so on, and then can be found by the researcher or also generated by participants or in collaboration between the two. In this study, participant-generated images were used. So researchers argue that photo elicitation based on participant-generated images is particularly useful for those who feel disempowered, as it allows participants to retain control over how and when they engage in the research. In exploring everyday, taken for granted things of research participants' lives, as it allows participants to reflect on their everyday activities in a way that is not usually done. And thirdly, to explore and account for social difference and hierarchy. So the aim of this study was to explore perspectives of different socioeconomic groups. And one of these groups were people living in poverty. So by using photo elicitation, the idea was to balance power between the researcher and participants and let people have control about what photos they want to take and what they want to discuss in interviews. Secondly, the study also aimed at exploring participants' everyday life, for which photo elicitation is considered useful. And thirdly, the study intended to explore the relationship between tourism and inequality. The study was conducted in Brazil, and although many people were lifted out of poverty, Brazil remains one of the most unequal nations in the world. When you Google Brazil, of course, you come across pictures of carnival, football, and beaches. But you also come across pictures that you can see in the screen now. It's a photo to represent inequality. On the left, you can see a favela where people live in relatively poor conditions. And on the right, you can see a housing estate with a tennis court and swimming pools, and especially a swimming pool on every floor. So inequality is very much part of the daily experience of Brazilians. And by using photo elicitation in this study, the idea was to expose social inequality. The project was conducted from June to August 2017 in a coastal destination in the northeast of Brazil. And tourism represents one of the most important economic sectors in that area, and almost the only opportunity for people to generate income. So people from different socioeconomic groups were asked if they were interested to participate in this study. And participants were owners and managers of tourism businesses, employees in these businesses, and individuals who sell craft at the beach, for example. If participants were interested, an initial briefing was set up in which the project aim and objectives and ethical implications were explained, and a consent form was handed out. The consent form particularly addressed copyright issues, which are very important to consider when you do photo elicitation studies. In this initial briefing, participants were given a disposable camera that was bought in the UK. You can see later that the quality of these photos was relatively poor, which, however, was not a concern for participants. When I returned the photos, they were quite often really happy with the photos, and they showed them to other members of the community around. And these members congratulated them actually on their photos. In the initial briefing then, participants were also given a broad question, which was, how does tourism influence your life? And some participants shared ideas of what photos they want to take, and everybody was encouraged to take the photos they want to take. After a very flexible time of 1 to 3 weeks, cameras were collected and the photos were developed and then returned to participants. Sometimes the interview took place straight away, and sometimes participants needed some time to reflect on the photos, and the interview was scheduled for later. I'm really sorry about this. Hello? I'm really sorry about this alarm now. I'm in the university. I think it was a test alarm, as I mentioned before. Okay, just to continue. So in the interview then, the participants were asked to choose a photo, explain why they took that photo and what it meant to them. Now I would like to share 5 photos with you. So this is the first photo. It shows a workplace of one of the participants. And this participant has been employed in the Posada for several years. And with the photo, he wanted to portray that because of his work in tourism, he could generate income and achieve a basic standard of living. This photo is taken by another participant. It shows his house. He explained that because of tourism and the income he generates, he could afford to build a house. The next photo shows a bike, which a participant could buy because of income from tourism. And this bike makes his way to work easier and faster. Another participant took this photo of a sign, which means preserve the nature. And he wanted to point out that tourism allows him to live and work in a natural environment because he could set up his business in that area and doesn't need to work in the city. And this last photo was taken by a Posada owner, and it shows guest reviews. And with this photo, the participant intended to show how proud she is on her achievements. I'm really sorry about this.
No worries. We can hear you very well despite
can hear me very
the alarm.
Well. Yes. Apart from the alarm, I'm really sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, so looking at these photos and several others, social difference rarely became evident in a specific photo, like it was shown in this photo. But by looking behind the photos, social difference became evident. What do I want to say with that? So the first 3 photos were taken by participants from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And these participants often choose elements to show how tourism improved their material conditions. For example, tourism enables them to generate income, which they then can use to build a house that provides shelter to them. Photos from higher socioeconomic groups chose elements to portray freedom and pride, for example. Their focus was much more on achieving non-material conditions and psychological needs. So in this way, visualized elements provided indication of the socioeconomic status of participants. People from lower socioeconomic backgrounds often face a struggle that they cannot afford material necessities, which is part of their lives. And this is what they showed in photos, actually. People from higher socioeconomic status do not face this struggle, but they have material resources available to them and can focus on achieving their psychological well-being. Also encouraged through photos, people often talked about events and relationships that were not seen in the photo. So for example, when talking about a workplace, one participant referred to a party of a business owner, and this business owner invited other business owner. And this participant observed that all people at the party were from a white background, whereas staff members were non-white. So in this way, a photo about a workplace led to discussions about racial inequality. So to come to an end, based on this study, it appears that social difference and hierarchy is very difficult to depict in a single photo, but it emerges when contrasting the visualized materials and photos generated by participants. And although issues were not pictured because they might even be unphotographable, photos prompted discussions about issues of inequality, which is part of people's daily life. So through the process of photo making, participants reflect on their daily lives and increases their awareness and helps them to articulate issues, which is why it is important to look behind and beyond the photo. Thank you very much, and sorry again for the alarms in the background.
Thank you to Therese. That was a very interesting talk indeed, and really goes to show how flexible visual methods can be for you to be able to use them in Brazil like that. I was particularly impressed by that picture, which for me spoke 1,000 words of the favela on one side and the high-rise swimming pools on the other side. And that's just amazing. I don't believe we've got any questions yet for you, Therese, but I'm sure that there will be some on YouTube coming up. So I'd like to invite everybody on YouTube, please use the chat function to ask questions of our speakers, and we'll pick them up towards the end, if that's okay. Thank you, Therese, particularly for coping with the fire alarm going off.
Thank you.
Yeah, don't panic. That's the first thing. Very good. Okay, so I'd like to thank Therese and hand over now to Louise Todd from Edinburgh and Napier University. I'll hand over to you now, Louise, and you can begin to share your screen whenever you like.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for having me along today. If a fire alarm goes off when I'm speaking, I probably will panic because I'm at home, so I'm definitely not expecting that to happen. I'll just start sharing my screen now. So hopefully everybody can see this. Okay, thanks again for having me. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about some of my research. The presentation I'm going to give today focuses upon a project I've been working on for some time with my colleague, Dr. Ashley Logan McFarlane, who isn't here today, but this is what I'm going to be speaking about, which is our ongoing project where we are investigating the semiotics of Edinburgh as a festival city. And we're particularly interested in the visual culture of Edinburgh. And I'll start here with this particular image, which is taken from Instagram, which is where we are sourcing our materials. For anybody who's not familiar with Edinburgh, this is the historic Old Town. It depicts the Royal Mile and specifically Parliament Square, and which is really the core and the heart of Edinburgh's festival fringe amongst the other summer festivals. More about that as we continue, but moving on. So today's presentation asks really, how is a festival city visually created in both physical and virtual space? And the project itself, or this particular presentation, I should say, draws from an ongoing research interest of mine, which is around the term festival city and how this is portrayed visually. Festival city is something which we're seeing appearing in industry context as brand markers and so on. It's also something that's been written about widely across the tourism, the urban studies, and the events literature, amongst other areas. Just to give some context on me, I suppose my background is in visual art, and I've worked for some time using visual methods in researching festivals, tourism and urban space. I've previously used photo elicitation. I used that in my PhD, semiotics today, and I'm using other methods, which I'll briefly talk about shortly. So today's presentation is actually based on one strand of the research. And as I mentioned before, this particular work is being done in collaboration with my colleague, Ashley. Her background is in digital ethnography, and as such, we're trying to hopefully bring our own perspectives to this study. So today I'm going to present really the background and some of the themes from the study into this semiotics of the festival city as it's represented and elicited through key stakeholders shared online images. At the moment, we're at the analysis stage of the project. So really we've gone through a literature review, we've been looking at themes and so on, and festival city context. So I'm going to introduce our research approach, briefly talk about semiotics, and give a few examples of the sort of data we've collected and that we're interested in. So when we're talking about festival city, our project is interested in asking, how is the festival city construct visually created in space, and how does a festival city visually carve out a space, both materially and also, or both material and physical places, but also a bit more intangibly and symbolically, perhaps online. And starting with the term festival city itself, there is much academic discussion around this topic and the title and term of festival city. In terms of the literature, mainly in tourism and urban studies, destination marketing, research and so on, we could say there are really both functional or technical definitions, like the one we see from Getz and Page here, talking about how festival cities can be characterised by this significant contribution of festivals and events to the economic and cultural viability of the city. Alongside this, we have the more conceptual definitions, such as we see here, which talks about a city where possibilities of the temporary event are optimally used, experiments are undertaken, new concepts are developed, which is quite an interesting definition. There are some related ideas across other branches of the literature. For example, there's been discussion around cultural cities in the urban studies literature after, for example, UNESCO designation and lobbying from destination management. We've seen many discussions about the creative city and the inhabiting, visiting creative classes in the more popular management literature, such as Florida and Landry, and discussions around experience cities, perhaps after Pine and Gilmore's experience economy and this idea of staging experiences for consumers. We've also seen a considerable discussion around the idea of the festivalisation of cities or destinations. For example, Richards and Palmer talk about this to a great extent, and also the eventification of places in urban spaces. Now, festivalisation is a 20th century, 1970s urban and cultural policy where the use of cultural phenomenon to achieve economic competitiveness is encouraged in this sort of post-industrial economy that we see today. And it stems partly from the explosion of festivals around the world, but also this eventalisation of regular cultural offers. And eventification, we could say, is related to this, and it's also the process by which the consumption of culture and space of products is turned into events. And it's important here to mention the widespread industry adoption of the Festival City brand and terminology within management settings. So there are many cities that class themselves as festival cities across the world, and that's for all sorts of reasons. So to build upon the definitions within the literature, we, while developing the literature review to inform the project in terms of Festival City, we also developed a more general overview and review of festival cities. We, at the time, identified around 80 or so around the globe, but numbers are growing. There could be well more festival cities by now. And we had different methods of identifying festival cities. There were different categories. For example, one was status as a recipient of the International Festival and Events Association World Festival and Event City Award. This has been running since 2010, and there are approximately 10 awards made every year. Cities include Denver, Dublin, Reykjavik, Shanghai, Sydney, all over the world. But this is a competitive process where cities self-nominate themselves to be festival cities, and it's a means of gaining this name or this tag to add to your brand. We also used cities which were designated as being members of the International Festival City Network, which includes Adelaide, Montreal, Berlin, and Edinburgh, of course. And then finally, we looked at cities which had explicit use of festival city or similar terms in their websites, promotional materials, and messages. So as I said, we came across around 80 or so, although those numbers may well have grown since then. So Edinburgh is classed as a festival city. Today there are 11 annual festivals and many more events that take place in Edinburgh. Many of them take place in the summer. The city has a long history of festivals, as you can see here, starting in 1947 with perhaps the best and most well-known festivals, the International Festival of Fringe and so on, through to the more recent additions such as the Hogmanay New Year's celebration and the International Art Festival. Now, these 11 festivals are managed and, well, they're looked after on a strategic level by Festivals Edinburgh, which is an umbrella organisation which was established in 2006. There's been much written about the impacts, particularly the economic and socio-cultural impacts of Edinburgh's festivals, and a number of industry-based reports and research undertaken. You see some of the data there that illustrates just how large Edinburgh's festivals are. More than 4.5 million attendances, more than £300 million generated for the Scottish economy, according to the research, and much discussion around the cultural value of the festivals within the city itself. So in terms of Edinburgh being a festival city, a number of years ago, Festivals Edinburgh and other stakeholders started to refer to Edinburgh as the world's leading festival city. And since then, recent strategies have actually pushed for this to be a formal type of brand, so strategic support and formal promotion of the festival city brand. The current strategy actually recommends sustaining and strengthening the festival city status as a major theme. And having this promotion of the Festival City brand worldwide with joint marketing strategy development with city partners. Interestingly enough, there has been, although the festivals have been growing and gaining more support, and towards the end of last year and the start of this year, pre-COVID, there was quite a lot of discussion in the media and the local community groups, and less support of the festival in the way that it takes over the city centre. And obviously we're in a situation this year where there haven't actually been any summer festivals. But to look at the images here, these are the sorts of, I guess, typical images of what we might expect from a festival city, such as Edinburgh, crowds on the street, again in the Royal Mile on the left of the screen there, and street performers in the historic centre, and then fireworks over Edinburgh Castle during the Hogmanay Festival at New Year. So just to give some context here, this particular research project, as I mentioned, draws from my ongoing multi-stranded research into the visual culture of Edinburgh as a festival city. You know, festival cities have largely been written about in terms of their brand, in terms of their function, in terms of their impacts. But I'm really intrigued by what this actually means, what the title means beyond the brand, and how different groups of stakeholders, from destination managers to local residents to visitors and communities, actually engage visually with a festival city. As Brian said earlier, visual research is very diverse. It gives opportunities for all people's voices to be heard, and I think that's really important. So I've got some images here that just represent some aspects of research approaches that I have been and do take. As well as visual research, I've been also using participative research. So some aspects of the research include autoethnographic drawing, which I was doing or have been doing between August and September, mainly focusing on the summer festivals and the winter festivals, where I've been in the streets watching and sketching and recording observations of people. And I took some of this work and actually transferred it or transformed it into paintings. And I recently exhibited some of those, some of my artwork from this study. And that's an area that I'm interested in continuing at the moment. I've been involved in various panels and talks during the Edinburgh festivals, such as the image here, which is one at Edinburgh Science Festival. And with a colleague, we ran a debate at the Edinburgh Fringe last year about introducing a deaf festival to Edinburgh's portfolio of festivals. This current project is an analysis of shared digital images, and I've also been involved in participative arts-based methods, encouraging members of communities to contribute to visual maps and so on. But this particular project, the aim, really, working with my colleague Ashley, is to try to gain an understanding of this balance between the material and the immaterial in terms of the tangible and visual or virtual festival city. So what we want to try and understand is how this physical festivalised environment within Edinburgh during the festivals is experienced and portrayed by stakeholders. And we particularly like this term digital architectures that Sarah Pink uses in terms of digital media. And as she says here, digital media has become so much part of how events are conceptualised, made and experienced. I would argue even more particularly now when we're all involved in digital online conferences and all sorts of other events. She goes on to say, as mobile media becomes increasingly ubiquitous, images are embedded in the digital architecture environments we move through. Now, the tool that we've used for this is Instagram, the shared online photo sharing platform. And the reasons for that are listed here. It's highly visual. It lends itself very well to visual analysis. And people, Instagram users, will be using it as they are experiencing and consuming places and engaging with them. So it's useful for being able to convey meaning through the photographs and so on. And we can use quite small samples of data with Instagram. That said, we collected more than 1,000 images. And in terms of the images we collected, we used event tourism stakeholder typology to identify the different stakeholders, mainly festival organisations, but also individuals, groups and organisations. The framework that we're using for analysing the images is a visual semiotic analysis. For anybody who's not familiar with semiotics, it's a basic definition of it, the study of signs or symbols, and particularly linked systems of signs and how these communicate different layers of meaning. Now, really anything can be taken as a sign, and in semiotic terms, a sign can be anything from an image. It could be something that's written, it could be something that's spoken, it could be a photograph, it could be a painting, it could be audiovisual or oral. There's been much written around the idea of tourism as a semiotic activity. We can say that in particular ways, tourists are semioticians, and that's been something which has been written about by the likes of Dean McCannell, by Arthur Assaberger and so on. And when you think about it, if we are visiting particular destinations, if we're visiting festivals, we do consume those signs. We often record them, particularly now that everybody has phones and digital cameras and so on. What we were particularly interested in is looking at this idea of how different signs can be represented in different ways. And we were looking at the work of particularly Charles Saunders Peirce, who was one of the modern founders of semiotics, and he developed a particular triadic framework of semiotic signs, looking at icons, indexical signs, and so on and so forth. But also Dean McCannell, who wrote about this idea of signs and markers within tourism, and markers being any kind of information or representation that identify an attraction, making it recognisable. So we're currently finessing our semiotic framework, and we're drawing mainly from the work of Charles Saunders Pearce and Dean McCannell. McCannell's text, The Tourist, draws from semiotic theory in its discussion of tourism, particularly as a postmodern activity. And as we see here, we're using those ideas to develop the framework where we're classifying the Instagram images as markers of the signs of Edinburgh and its festivals. So we're looking for particular markers within that, signifying the festival city to the different interpretants who are posting, reviewing and sharing the online images. We've been looking at different approaches, such as Charlotte Echner's tourism marketing approach and her suggested framework for analysing the images. She proposed a series of flexible steps in her paper, which is from some time ago now, but it's one of the few papers that really identifies a framework to use for semiotics in tourism. And just really now, to finish off, I just wanted to share a few of the images we've collected. This one was posted by the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and we're looking at the data within this, the images, to analyse and code different themes from the literature and the destination image context. What could be iconic signs of the festival city? We see a lot of shots of the festivals using Edinburgh's castle as a backdrop. There are always crowds of people. Quite often, for example, the Fringe used its programme here and its 70th anniversary. Also here is another example of Edinburgh's Hogmanay. For anybody who's unfamiliar with the Hogmanay Festival, Hogmanay is a Scottish term. It refers to New Year, and the Hogmanay Festival in Edinburgh is it's a very large-scale festival. It takes place over the Christmas New Year's period, and it attracts the second largest number of tourists to Edinburgh, or visitors, I should say. As you can see here, it's particularly busy and has been in the past. Hogmanay is the one which, at the end of last year and start of this year, along with the Christmas festival, raised a lot of concerns because of worries over the over-commoditisation of Edinburgh's centre and so on. But there are particular portrayals and images that we associate with Hogmanay: fireworks, lights, crowds and crowds of people. And here's another Hogmanay shot with the iconic view of the fireworks over the castle. Similarly, we're looking at general street views. Street performers within the Royal Mile is something that's very much associated with the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Oh yes, and that's one that Ashley included. We are also coming across these sorts of more comical images using pets and things like that. So to finish up, in terms of where we're at, as mentioned, we're still in the stages of analysing the information that we've collected, the data, but our reflections, we do anticipate these particular contributions, perhaps the methodological contributions, that the visual semiotic method is still relatively quite unexplored in tourism, and it hasn't really been used too much in event tourism research. It has been used in other settings. So there could be potential for further extensions, further uses in tourism and event settings. Also conceptually, I think it's particularly interesting if we could come up with a renewed understanding of the festival city paradigm beyond this idea of the brand. What does it actually mean in terms of being some kind of interplay or relationship amongst the physical and digital aspect of the cities? And because of that, there could be potential contributions there for these different areas in academic terms. And also management implications. A lot of cities do class themselves as festival cities. It's used often as a brand, but what does it really mean? And what could be the benefits there in terms of destination management, branding, and stakeholder engagement? Really, I just wanted to finish with saying thank you very much for listening today, and I'd be happy to take any questions or suggestions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Louise. That's a most interesting talk. I was very interested in that very last picture you showed of the dog reading the Fringe magazine, and just wondering how semiotician would break that one down, what that says about the festival. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you at the end. There'll certainly be at least one from me. So, I'd like to just say thank you very much for your talk, and please stay with us, and we'll come back and have a question and answer at the end. For the audience on YouTube, I'd please ask you to keep firing your questions in, and they will be picked up, and then we can ask them of the speakers. Okay, so our third and final speaker today is Eugenio Conti from Dalarna University in mid-Sweden. It's really nice to have you along today, Eugenio.
Thank you.
Please feel free to share your PowerPoint if you have one straight away, and I'll hand over to you without further ado.
Yes. So, okay. Thank you very much for giving me the possibility to present in this interesting webinar. So I actually could recognize what I do a lot in the previous speakers, and although I depart from a slightly different sort of subject when it comes to my research, I am a PhD student at Dalarna University. I am sort of halfway through the process. And my research started from a project that was interested in getting to know more about experience development, tourism experience development in forest areas in the sort of region of inner Scandinavia. So that you can see actually here in the map. So the idea basically was to understand more about what do tourists value when it comes to, you know, experiences in the forest. And in order to understand that, I actually took a look at the concept of experience value, which is a very important concept when it comes to understanding, you know, the backbone of tourism experiences. Now, when it comes to experience value, experience value is a kind of concept that has been sort of studied according to different perspectives. I have a background in social science and anthropology, therefore I was very much interested in what interpretivist and social constructivist schools of thought have to say about experience value. Because a traditional economic understanding of this concept would say that, you know, value is a difference between a need and, you know, the fulfillment of a need and the sacrifice that that is undertaken in order to, you know, attain that need. Very sort of objective concept, very measurable and linear, even when multidimensional. But when it comes to interpretivist and social constructivist views over value, we can actually sort of see how value is not really sort of determined by someone. It's not objectified, cannot be objectified by someone. It is something that exists within the tourist life world. The life world being, you know, a world that is grounded in an individual's everyday. So a very phenomenological sort of concept in a way. Moreover, value, there is this idea that value is constructed based on past memories, as well as present situations, imagined futures. So it's not something that exists just in one single context or a situation. Whereas, you know, more traditional views over values, but generally also contemporary views that are grounded in positivist understanding of reality would say that, yeah, there is a context in which value emerges and we measure that context and therefore we measure value. But it's not like that according to the understanding that I sort of side with. So there is also this idea that people make sense of value with sort of personal thoughts and preferences of what, on the other hand, can be socially beneficial, recognizable, or socially endorsed. So value can be at the same time real, lived, and at the same time imaginary. And this is where I sort of, put together the idea of all of these, previous understandings about value rooted in interpretivism and social constructivism with the idea of hyperreality. So the idea that experience value is something that is actually grounded in the hyperreal as well as the real. So the concept of hyperreality actually in a consumption context has been sort of defined as an imagination, a desire of reality that is produced as an hyperreality in order to consume reality. So in tourism, we have, the tourist gaze, which is an hyperreal gaze, can be said to be an hyperreal gaze, an hyperreal existential authenticity. We have hyperreal landscapes that are performed by tourists through photography. And what I perceive tourist photography to be, especially on social media, as I will, say later, is simulations actually of reality that actually perform this sort of blend between reality and hyperreality. So issue is that interpretive research on experience value in tourism are, not as developed as the positivist ones. So we need more sort of research that is based on interpretivist frameworks. So that are designed around open-ended inquiries with the phenomenon of value being the starting point of the research. And that is not, in which the aim is not to develop linear measures, but, sort of in-depth views. And that's why I went with ethnography, which is a method that has been recently advocated in this kind of studies, because it helps, to access performances, digital performances that relate to the user's identity, emotions, and memories, and so on. And I sort of go further in analyzing online photography. So online tourist photography that is performed on social media, because that's a place in which I believe we can access ideal way of being and ideal way of being somewhere. And, motivations about sharing this being with others. So a bit more about how I do it, how I look at experience value on online photography. I choose Instagram because Instagram is one of the most popular visual social medias used in tourism. And I use both archive and elicited sort of data. So the archive data is the actual post, is the user, is the profile, is basically me going around online and look at what's happening. And while I do that, I take field notes that are about what I observe, what I interpret, and my reflections on that. So there is a sort of level of me interpreting what's happening and what I see on the screen. But at the same time, I also go a bit behind the curtain, and I sort of try to ask users more about what do they mean when they post something. The good thing about Instagram is that Instagram is not just about pictures, but it's also about so many different hypertexts. So you have hashtags, you have tags, you have hashtags, geotags. And all these concur in creating a sort of hyper model, in a way, artifact simulation, which is something that I ask participants to elaborate a bit more on through conversations that I perform using Direct, actually. So I have both archive and elicited posts in a way. Yeah. So I got some results already, although this is a sort of ongoing research, and I will elaborate a bit better close to the end on why. So when the original question was to analyze experience value when it comes to forests, well, there are, of course, several findings. I cannot report all of them here, but what I can do is actually reporting some that I find perhaps most interesting when it comes to also research agendas, current research agendas, when it comes to experiences, when it comes to experience value propositions, and when it comes to experience value in general. So definitely Instagram is a tool that not only me as a researcher can access to in order to know about what tourist values valued. It's something that anybody interested in developing value propositions can actually, access. And one of the most interesting things is actually that although Instagram can be seen as a mainly visual social media, the hypertextuality of Instagram posts allow to deliver sensorial elements that are other than visual and that are very valued. And the interesting thing is that you can access also the experiential meaning behind these sensorial elements, which is what, an interpretive understanding of value would be interesting in. So for example, here I put them on hashtags, but actually sometimes they weren't even hashtags, but these interesting keywords that were occurring. So silence. Silence is not just silence as a, as a sort of hedonic consumption of silence, but a silence that is validated because it reminds of peace, of the place itself that is being experienced as a sanctuary from the everyday, compared to noisy urban areas, for example. Then you have the elements of dullness and coldness that sort of validate something that is perceived as testing, that is experienced as testing, and raw, and wild, and very genuine. So there is this idea of perhaps experiencing something that is not pleasant, but that at the same time bring the tourist out of the comfort zone. And this is very important because I would say that one of the most important research venues around experiences in consumer studies is about pain. So the meaning of pain. So not always pleasure when it comes to experiences and leisure. And then for another example is the idea of softness, for example, that I could see associated to fogs, for example, breeze, and that sort of remind of a landscape in which someone is immersed that is perceived as gentle and mystic. Now, utopian and eudaimonic values are both important research venues for experience value in tourism, because tourism is too much researched in its hedonic components. So hedonic components meaning components that relate to pleasure, again, but eudaimonic experiences, value, would relate more to the concept of eudaimonic happiness, that instead is related to meaning, to virtue, to the pursuit of well-being. And this is something that actually is performed by tourists through online photography and through photography on Instagram. And I could collect several ideas about this, which I briefly thematized here into 5 different conceptions of wilderness. So I've seen a lot of research that, end up saying that experiences in an environment like a forest is about experiences in the wild, and experiences something that is, sort of not crowded or, not civilized and so on. But that I believe is a rather superficial idea of what is being experienced. And actually, I could sort of find different ideas of, different meanings that are attached to the idea of wilderness. So there is an idea of wilderness that is about disconnecting. It's about disconnecting from a urban lifestyle that is perceived as hectic, for example. There is an idea of wilderness, as I mentioned before, that is about getting out of the comfort zone, experiencing flow through, sort of demanding sometimes activities, because those activities are instrumental to learn something new and to grow. Wilderness that is, about being together, bridging human/pet or animal divides that perhaps in urban environments, in civilized environments, they matter more because there is a social structure that make them matter, where this is a space that is wild in a sense that it allows those relationships to be bridged again. And then like a wilderness as an area in which tourists can express themselves to the full extent. They are sort of liminal senses of self. They can sort of express themselves to the full extent that they feel that they need to express. A concept that sometimes has been described as resistant bodies in the liminality literature. So this idea that finally you are able to, you know, to take all the structures out of you. So here I put some examples. What I wanted to do here was to sort of exemplify the visual part, but also the textual part, because I think, as I said, and there would be much more to say and to present here, but yeah, of course, time and format constraints do not allow me that. But already here you can see that there is definitely a hypermodality that is implicit in online photography, especially on Instagram. But I think this is a trend that, you know, in a way relates to all social media nowadays. And here you can see examples of also how, you know, a text allow to put a picture in context and to say something more about what is it meant with that picture, what, you know, what is it that the user find it important to say. And here you can see like some sort of quotes that introduce some of the themes of the wilderness that I just talked about. The importance of water here, for example, on your left. Survival and, you know, freeing the body, going back to being fully human, and so on. Now, finally, I want to close by mentioning some sort of opportunities and challenges that I feel, you know, need to be considered, because this is a method that has a lot of potential, definitely. First of all, you can sort of have a kind of photo elicitation that is sort of made through pictures that are produced by the participant themselves. So it's not something that I create as a researcher. I am asking someone to elaborate, you know, on what they actually produce. So as I said, it's not only about visuals, but about hypertextuality. So different kinds of sort of vehicles of meaning. And the hypertext is itself, and the way the hypertext is arranged is actually meaningful. And it's something that is interesting to analyze. Because by itself, it can allow us to investigate more the community behind an hypertext. So which online, a sense of community exists through a sort of digital flow. And that sort of allow us to see how something connect to something valuable, something meaningful connect, for example, to social endorsement. So overall capacity of very much in-depth phenomenological understanding of what is being experienced and valued. There is a capability of reaching a potentially unlimited number of posts and users according to different qualitative strategies. Again, this is like, we go often too much often online with the idea of finding quantity and with the idea of finding big data, but actually also for small data and qualitative research. You know, the possibility of reaching so many people and so many different artifacts and visual artifacts, it's really important because it allow us to develop very different sort of sampling strategies, criterion based on heterogeneity, homogeneity, emergent, theoretical, whatever. And you're also always doing field work when you do something like this, because you're always online. You're always like one touch by being on your field. So that allow, you know, researchers that are used to field work to constantly, you know, go back to what they are doing and you know, engage in new data and produce new reflections. But there are also many challenges that, in my opinion, need to be further considered, and we're still very much behind when it comes to that. Methodological sort of considerations that need to be sort of stated. For example, positionality. So how does positionality work online, and ethics also, because we're not really sure if when we are talking with someone online, it's actually, we're talking to a person, we're talking to a user, and what's the difference between the user and the person? And that I believe affects a lot, you know, questions of ownership and ethical questions of ownership, but also questions of, you know, how do we as researchers are positioned according to, you know, who we perceive our user to be. Then again, of course, hyperreal aspects that, yes, the participants feel the need to talk about, but I'm really against the idea that Instagram is a big deposit of narcissistic tendencies. I don't really believe so. I think that's an exaggeration. Photographs that we put online are about how we see ourselves, all right, and how we frame ourselves, and how do we want others to see us. So they are expressions of ourself. But again, what is this self that we are talking about? Is the real self? Is the digital self? Is the experience itself? Is the digital experience that is created through the post? And can we even make such distinction when we talk about, artifacts that are put online about something that is being experienced? The control of the interview process is also something that it's very important to consider, because you are not, as a researcher, in control of the interviewing environment. You are not even sure that you can actually complete an interview, especially when you do an interview online, like the way I've been doing, that is based on exchanging text on direct. Well, you know, it might be that suddenly the conversation stops. It sort of starts again in a couple of days. So it's a very different interviewing environment that we need to write more about in terms of methodology and you know, perhaps to do and not to do. And then, of course, by using you know, an interviewing method that is based on, you know, chatting and reaching participants online, asking them to talk more about what they do and what they put online in terms of pictures, we can, you know, reach a lot of people. Yes, we can elicit the interview through photos. Yes, but at the same time, we cannot access body language. We cannot access non-textual or non-verbal communication that in a normal interviewing environment, you know, might be important to consider. So a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges by using these methods. But the results are very encouraging. And with this, I'd say thank you. And I will be more than up to take any questions now. Yes. So I will stop sharing.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that, Eugenio. Very interesting talk indeed. One full of lots of hypers there. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you. I've actually got a question right now, which can be for you. And if the others also feel that they want to join in, they can. So first question is this hyperreal gaze. When does it start forming? Does it start forming before the destination is even visited?
It depends on what perspective you follow, because if you follow a more objectivist / realist perspective on what's actually happening during the experience, you would probably think that there is a linear timeline. So you start by anticipating something that will happen, then you experience it, and then you remember it. And that is something that is the baseline of the so-called customer journey in tourism. But phenomenological understanding of reality actually, according to these ideas, it's not that simple. And hyperreality is part of a constant hermeneutic spiral about sense making that we make, putting together constantly all the time, imagine futures, past memories, what we are currently experiencing. There isn't really a way to discern, you know, and specify like a specific moment in which something is happening. And yeah, there could be a lot to say about this, but I think that could make it for an answer.
Excellent, thank you. How our other two speakers, do you have anything to say about how reality is created within your own context? I guess that's probably not the case then. That's okay. Let me ask the question then of you all, just to begin with. Nick is going to come in a few minutes, I hope, and ask some of the other questions. Let me ask a general question to everybody. How do visual methods, how do you think they compare to the classical data collection methods like questionnaires and interviews? Can visuals be the main data collection method, or can they only really be ever useful for complementing the other more traditional methods? Who'd like to start? Louise, you've unmuted.
Yeah, I think that they can, of course, be the main method of collecting data. But I'm perhaps coming at this from the perspective of being an artist to a certain extent, because that's where I was originally situated, and then found myself doing a PhD in the context of a business school, which wouldn't really perhaps be the natural home for visual research. And certainly, as you said earlier, Brian, most of the research in tourism and events and so on, certainly a lot of the research I've looked at is really framed by the business side of things and the management side of things, although there are notable journals, obviously, and that look more at the social sciences and humanities and tourism and so on. But I've always very strongly felt that visuals can be the most important form of gathering data. But I think we also have to bear in mind that particularly in the Western world, that we very much connect visuals with the notion of perhaps art and aesthetics. So they very much become about, for many people, they're considered as something decorative or something which is somehow additional and aesthetically pleasing or not, and down to taste. And equally, I would say there needs to be a separation between visual methods, which are perhaps looking at phenomenon or phenomena in all sorts of different contexts that aren't necessarily visual themselves, or we're perhaps more concerned with looking at the visuality and what is the meaning of the visual itself. What are the underlying layers of meaning? Is it to do with aesthetics, or is it something completely different? I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's my thoughts on it. It's something I feel quite strongly about.
Yeah, if I can sort of build on that, I think that it's important to understand the sort of the visuality that we are exposed to today and that we produce today from an artistic point of view, because when it comes to at least my area of research, what I notice is either studies that place pictures that are generated online under a sort of technocratic view, heavily technocratic, so we can sort of cut them into different components and generalize like we're all sort of robots producing the same pictures over and over. And on the other hand, you have very sort of skeptical and negative views towards user-generated pictures as something that is, as I said before, very narcissistic. It's about brag art. So it's about bragging always, and it's fake. Whereas I believe that both these understandings are very partial. And it's important to instead look at the self-expression and, this sort of art, aesthetic sense and value behind an aesthetics.
Yeah, from my perspective in my research, I needed the combination between visual and textual or verbal, because participants took pictures and sometimes it was a very similar picture, but the participants interpreted that picture in a different way. So in this way, the communication about the picture was very important for me. So regarding your question, I think visual methods or the visuals are very powerful, but we need verbal communication with it in order to explain the picture.
Okay, thank you. Yes, indeed. So different positions on that, which is, I think, part of the interesting thing about visual research is that there are a number of different approaches to it. And I don't believe that any of them are necessarily more valid than another. Therese, can I ask you another question which has been asked of you? I'll read it out. Thanks for the great presentation and spectacular alarm bells. From the photo you used in the presentation, we can see the voice and the presence of materials, symbols, and signs that matter to the participants. But I'm curious to find out more. Do you have a strategy for what may be absent and not articulated through the participant photography, but which still may matter?
Yes. So participants were also asked if they wanted to take a picture but could not take that picture. So in the initial briefing, for example, people told me about violence, that they aimed to portray violence in a photo, but they didn't know how to. So by asking participants about photos they could not take, it's a way to discover these things that are not actually in pictures.
Yes, so it's almost like your interviews are helping them. The photo elicitation is also, there's another side to that, which is the anti-elicitation, which is what the photos couldn't say. Well, they can express that in words. That's quite interesting. Eugenio, what would you say about the absence of voices in your research? Are there absent voices, absent opinions? How do you deal with that?
Well, on the one hand, the sort of textual information that is sort of available in different formats according to the participants, of course, choice. They are able to clarify a lot in terms of what is not only what is being meant with a visual, but also what cannot be expressed with a visual. And that's something that I sort of found very important to mention when it comes to other sensorial valuations, definitely. I can also relate a lot to sort of this idea of the necessity to get more about what is being seen, like Therese was saying, because I couldn't gather a lot of the things that I could gather actually just by looking at the pictures alone. But given this, there's always something I think that is absent. And we can have questions that are, tailored around that. But when it comes to my research area, it's very difficult to induce the participant to talk about that, because a lot of the interview is biased about what is being there, and that's what the participant really want to talk about. And that's also a memory. That's also the thing. It's also memory. So what is not there might be difficult to actually, remember and consider.
Louise, do you have any thoughts?
Well, speaking from the perspective of the research I've just been discussing, this particular strand of it, there are many voices missing because essentially we're looking closely at images that are shared largely by destination management stakeholders in various forms. So in that sense, we're conscious of many layers of voices missing from that particular setting. And there's a very particular or specific series of recurring signs and symbols that are being portrayed there. However, my overall view at the moment is when I'm, in terms of my project, when I'm trying to understand what's meant by Festival City, I've been keen to try and understand other voices, also using visual methods, and looking at residents and local communities that are not perhaps situated physically in the same place, and they're definitely not in the city centre, but by using different visual methods to try and draw out how they visualise a festival city. And there are some similarities and some differences. And I think perhaps it rings slightly with what Eugenio has been talking about, this hyper reality, and the management stakeholders present these very polished and very specific views of the festival city, but they're going to do that because they're promoting it, they're selling it, and then that's picked up on by a lot of the visitors. And also looking at Instagram, we're not using Instagram in the same way that you are, Eugenia. We're using it as secondary data. We're not interviewing people. But it is really interesting to see the way that images recur and they're re-represented and presented again in different ways. But yeah, I think it is important to think about what's not being said, the voices that aren't being represented, and always at least be mindful of that.
Thank you, Louise. Yes, I can see a screen of all the presenters here, and we're all nodding vigorously that it's the absence that's as important as the presence as well, and we need to acknowledge that. I've got one question that a couple of people have been asking actually for Louise. Louise said that she's been doing some ethnographic drawing and has exhibited her own work recently, which is exciting. Can she give more details about what ethnographic drawing is and where and how did she exhibit? And how does that help us better understand community experiences?
This is a project that I've largely worked on in my personal time, but it's closely related to my research in my role where I am. Essentially, at the core of it is, I guess, the idea of the tourist gaze. And as somebody who's a resident in Edinburgh, background as an artist, an interest in visual research, and also a tourist myself, over the years I've become quite fascinated in the way that people engage with and observe Edinburgh as a festival city and the festivals. So I spent a bit of time in the midst of the festival, in the streets, as performances are taking on, visiting particular sites, and starting by sketching what I saw there. And in my own time, further down the line, I've developed that into a series of paintings, which I exhibited with an art group who I work with, which was interesting. And now I'm at a point of trying to draw everything together, because it's quite an interesting, well, for me personally, it's interesting to be almost gazing upon the gazers and reflecting on how they're engaging with that. It's something that I guess is at its relatively early stages. I exhibited in a gallery in Edinburgh during lockdown, just as it was being restricted. So it went from being probably going to be an actual physical exhibition to an online exhibition, but it was a physical exhibition. So there were opportunities for people to engage with the work itself. And yeah, so that's about all I can really say. It was only last month I was exhibiting. So it is a project I'm working on and can't really say a huge amount about it at the moment apart from that.
Thank you very much. We're just about run out of time now, unfortunately. There were so many more questions I could be asking you, and I'm sure the audience as well, but unfortunately our time is limited. So what I'd like to do is, before we wind things up, I'll come back at the very end to do that. I'd like to hand over the floor to Nika just very briefly, because Nika's got some exciting news for us. Would you like to come on, Nika?
I would. It's a classic. The cat just came on. I'm sorry about that. There's one question, two questions I have. Yes, I know it's a classic, isn't it? I'll send a couple of questions to Eugenia because we didn't have time to ask, and they're a bit complex. But I'll send them. I'll send them directly to him. But what I'd like to focus on really is I would like to say that we have had the very, very pleasant news that Brian and I proposed a special interest group to Atlas on visual research and tourism, and this has just now been accepted. So what we would like to do, obviously, is to invite you to register your interest, and also we would appreciate it if some of you put 50 to 100 words together to send it through in support of this special interest group so that it can be officially established. So that's all I had to say, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll pass you back on to Brian, and I'll contact Eugenio separately. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nika. So that's exciting news. A special interest group in Atlas on visual research methods. Please, as Nika says, do contact us to express an interest in joining. And also, we would be very grateful for some kind words of encouragement by way of supporting the SIG. And I look forward to working with you all together on visual research methods in tourism in the future. So it just remains for me to say, first of all, an apology to the presenters that there wasn't actually very much time for questions and answers. I know that there are, as Nika says, there are more questions coming through. Hopefully we can feed those through to you and maybe perhaps even put you in contact with the people who were asking them, so that they can get their answers directly from you, and we've made a contact that way as well, which is always a good thing. And so it just remains for me now to say thank you immensely to our 3 presenters today. I really do appreciate you coming online and giving us your thoughts on your exciting projects, all 3 of them. I look forward to seeing them in publication eventually and hearing more about them. So thank you very much for coming on and giving such slick presentations under, in one case at least, some quite difficult circumstances. And I also want to say an enormous big thank you as well to Atlas for hosting this event, to Leontine for being here to make things happen, and behind the scenes here, pressing all the buttons and making sure everything actually worked. So I think that really concludes the session for today. The biggest thank you goes to our audience on YouTube. It's all about you being out there, otherwise we'd be talking into the void. So I want to thank you for tuning in today, and I hope to meet you all virtually again sometime, and please do contact us with an interest to joining the SIG.